Alright, so now we're going to talk about 5 new movies that came out this year, and typically when I do these, like these new releases, especially this year, it's almost kind of begrudgingly, where it's like, oh, well, let's just get out of the way talking about this stuff, and some of it's stuff that I saw like months ago that I'm just now getting around to talking about. But with these 5, there's 3 at least that I'm just really, really passionate about, and I kind of can't wait to talk about. So I'm really happy about that. And I want to start with Beau Is Afraid, and I'm just gonna put something out there right now. As far as talking about Beau Is Afraid, we are absolutely going to do that. But I do also want to throw a warning out, I guess, as far as what you may or may not be here for. Um, in order for us to talk about Beau Is Afraid, the thing about this movie is that I felt it on an extremely sort of visceral level, and I think it has to be, far and away, one of, if not the most vivid and accurate portrayals on screen of crippling anxiety. Like, the whole time. Like, you hear about stuff like, Uncut Gems, which is obviously great, and people say, like, oh, it's like having a panic attack for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Um, yeah, this is, like, when I try to explain to people what exactly is wrong with me and how I feel about having crippling anxiety 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, and I can just never seem to get through it. It seems so irrational to everybody. I feel like I feel seen by this movie in a way to where I could basically say, as unflattering as this might sound, I feel like I can go to people and say, if you watch Beau Is Afraid, that's the best grasp you're gonna have on what the inside of my head is like. So when I say I just want to throw a warning out there, I feel like talking about Beau Is Afraid is gonna feel less like a movie review and more like a therapy session. So, not all of it. There's a couple of things here that I can't say I fully relate to, but a very vast majority of the movie makes perfect sense to me, and I totally get if it wouldn't to many others. Because I know it's one of those movies where the people that have loved it have really, really loved it, and the people who hate it, just, it's, it might look really indulgent or just being weird for the sake of weird, but there's that case where, like, sometimes a movie just doesn't click with you and you wonder where the hype is coming from, and it's like I felt like I saw something so incredibly familiar but also really specific in this movie to where I immediately understood that probably not everybody is gonna really grasp what it's doing, I guess. So, and a lot of it might look like total nonsense, and I totally get that. But, like, everything made sense to me, and I totally get also that this is obviously a movie that's going to be up for interpretation, so there may be people that also love this movie, but maybe saw something completely different from what I saw. To me, it's something very clear about what it is, but I also get that movies like this can be, anything to anybody. It's like a Rorschach test, basically. So, I don't mean to speak in, like, fact when I say what's happening in the movie here is this. I'm just saying that as far as how I feel when I see those images and the things that it conjures in my mind that I've never been able to quite put into words or to really express to people or convey to people, that's what I saw. So that's how we're going into this, and if you feel the same way, that's fantastic, and if not, maybe you see it in a totally different way, or maybe you just hate the movie. And all of these are pretty reasonable, I would think. Like, if somebody were to totally hate this movie, it'd be like, I get it. Because I feel like that's expected anyway with Astor's filmography in general, with Hereditary and Midsummer, where it's... I do like that we're still... Even though Beau Is Afraid feels like a totally different movie from those, there's still some themes here, like the really fucked up family connections are still carrying over, and the fact that this may not immediately look like a horror movie on its surface. It definitely there's something absolutely frightening like throughout this movie. So whether you whatever however you'd want to categorize it is totally up to you. Pitch black comedy also would be totally reasonable to label this as. But yeah, so to talk about this movie's portrayal of anxiety, which is the entire 3 hours of it, as far as I'm concerned, I will say right up front, there are two things that I can't say are like, oh my god, that's, how I feel. Um, like, the mom stuff is going to play a really big part in this, and that's something where it's like, that I don't personally relate to like I do everything else I'm looking at, but I understand it, especially with kind of how late it really comes to fruition in the movie. I understand, like, where it's coming from. And the other fear going on, this sort of irrational or existential fear in Beau, in regards to, we'll say the part of him that culminates in the Parker Posey scenes, is something that's kind of this movie's own, I think. But apart from that, just in general, the idea of like these inherent fears and these existential fears and these irrational fears, are what the movie was about to me. And given the title of the movie, that seems to be what the intent was. But as far as like the real specifics of what they are and how they're portrayed, is what's really sticking out to me, especially in this first half hour. Like, you go into this movie and like when you already know Astor's vibe, it can be really alarming that he's made a 3-hour movie. But going into it, once we were in this first half hour, I feel like I was already in love with it. I feel like this movie already really understood me on a really deep level in a way hardly anything else has, if anything else has, in its first half hour, and then it continued to show that as it went on. Where this first half hour just really takes those individual moments and those individual fears and makes them occur one right after the other. Like, there were so many, I just wrote them down. There's, first of all, the world that he lives in, where he basically lives in what appears to be the purge 24 hours a day, and that's just the world he lives in. And then he goes home to his apartment, and he lays down to go to sleep, and first of all, there's like spiders on the floor, so that's a whole thing, but then he's continuously waking up, and taking out the reason he's waking up for a second, just that idea of the clock being there, and you like waking up like every hour or like every half an hour, and it's like, well, if you have trouble sleeping anyway, and then you feel like you go to sleep and you're like, oh my god, did I finally sleep a full night? And you look over, it's been like 45 minutes. So just that image alone of him waking up with the clock constantly in sight was one thing. And then there's the reason he's waking up, which is he's being harassed by knocking at the door, which knocking at the door is the worst fucking thing ever. Like, nobody should ever have any reason to do that for any reason whatsoever. But not only is that just knocking at the door in general, but he's being harassed for something that he's not even doing. So there's that, and it's happening over and over again. That's what's waking him up like every hour. And then that eventually, when he finally does go to sleep, he ends up oversleeping. He ends up sleeping for like 12 hours or something, and he's about to miss a flight. And so there's this whole thing of having to leave for a period of time to where you have to make sure you have everything and you don't forget anything. So there's that whole thing. And he forgets like his floss. And then in the time it takes him to walk away from the door, to get floss, and then come back, his bags and the keys to his apartment have been stolen. And remember, he lives in the fucking purge. So there's that. So there's that also, that lingering shot on the fact that the only security he has is the chain on his door, and those chains just look so fucking worthless, especially when this chaos is happening. But there's even little things, like when he's running back from getting the floss, he trips over a cord. And it's always, if you trip over a cord, something is coming down. And it's like, in this case, I think it's a lamp, but like in most cases, it's like my computer or something. But there's just that feeling of tripping on a cord and knowing something valuable is probably about to hit the floor really hard. That whole thing, and it happens in like, all of these are happening like in quick succession. And then there's the whole thing of Googling a health concern. And it's all of this is happening also, where it's like he's taken a pill without water, and he's afraid of what's going to happen with that. And of course, he Googles a health concern, a very minor health concern that probably wouldn't be anything. But sure enough, the first thing that comes up is an obituary, because that's what the fuck happens when you do that. And then he becomes afraid that he's gonna, die because he didn't take this pill with water. So he has to run across the street to get water at this convenience store. His card is declined, and he's digging through for change. And the cashier is getting really irate the more and more this goes. And of course, he's had to leave the apartment unattended. It's unlocked, and now all these people from this chaos, this purge outside, is going into his building, and we know they're going right up to his space, and then that becomes the whole thing. And it's just one after the other, and it's like that's pretty much exactly what anxiety is. Where if it's not one thing, it's another, and if it's not that thing, it'll be another thing, and so on, forever. And it's just that's what it is. And it's like to convey that in this first half hour by taking all of these irrational fears and just making them happen in quick succession. And it's like that's basically the biggest fear of all, is just all of those culminating in this little span of time. And that's basically setting up Beau as a character. Like that's where I at least knew, like, oh, okay, so me and Beau essentially share a lot of a mindset, and so that's when I was able to say, all right, I'm like in for this movie now. Like whatever happens next, I get it and I feel it. Like I feel it really viscerally, and so then you can say those are a lot of the irrational fears. To go on into more like existential fears and probably more universal fears. This scene is followed up by him getting a phone call from Bill Hader, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this phone call from Bill Hader feels very Lynchian, where it's like we're getting information and it sounds like there's no way it could be real by the way Hader's describing things, and then it ends up being like the worst possible scenario, but there's still this, but is it real or is it not? Is there a mistake? Is this... And then the way they kind of keep confirming what you don't want confirmed. And it's like I said, one of the sort of great existential fears and probably universal fears of what's going on here. And so that sets the stage for what the essential plot of the movie is, if you want to call it that. And so this continues to escalate until he gets to Nathan Lane and Amy Ryan's house. And then this is another case where it's like, I don't know how many people watching this movie are going to feel what I'm feeling when I see these scenes, but like I said, I feel like the movie's speaking directly to my internal fears that I've never been able to explain to anybody. Where, like I said, it could be seen totally differently by somebody else, but the way I took these Nathan Lane and Amy Ryan scenes is he gets severely injured and they take him in, because luckily Nathan Lane's a surgeon. So it's like, this is the luckiest thing that could happen, right? But the thing now is that he is a guest, a very, very welcome guest in this home, this very lived-in home, but there's also a lot of, maybe there's eggshells to walk around because they've got a daughter who seems out of her mind, and it's like it's the teenage girl, like really angry, constantly cliche, but amped up in this very exaggerated way. And then they've got a son that was in the military that was killed in action, and they've got his picture on the wall. And in this very darkly funny bit of feeling just sort of out of place, or like I said, like you're kind of constantly having to walk around eggshells. They're putting together a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, and the puzzle's picture is the picture of their dead son that's also on the wall. And it's like, so there's already a vibe here, and it's like, it should be a place that you feel extremely comfortable and extremely welcome, because they're being so kind and so inviting and so generous. But like, as it goes on, there's something about being, for me, there was always this thing, and continues to be this thing, about being in other people's houses. I don't know if it's just like this feeling of intrusion on somebody else or what, but it's like, no matter how invited you are, you still feel completely out of place, and like anything is going to go horribly wrong. And there's one particular thing about that too that's personified by the daughter, and ultimately in a very extreme way by Amy Ryan, where it's like when I talk about having to walk around eggshells around certain things, it's when you feel this way, you're kind of constantly in fear that even the nicest people are gonna have, like, you're always under the impression that if you do something that's maybe slightly off, or like maybe you put something slightly out of place or something, or whatever it is, to disrupt what's going on here, no matter how minor it is, the fear is that these people are going to react with the most extreme emotion. And so, like I said, that's pretty much personified in the daughter, where it's like where he's recuperating in her room where he woke up from unconsciousness. And so she's having extreme reactions to him being in her room, and then when he offers to switch her places and give her the couch, she has the same reaction to the different scenario, and it's this lose-lose situation. And it brings on this feeling of, like, and the idea of bringing out the most extreme emotions in people, even the nicest people, is this feeling of, like, you feel like there are these moments where you might feel like everybody is angry or hostile towards you, and you're not, like, basically just for existing, and you get to these places where it's like the entire world just fucking hates you, and there's nothing there's nothing explicit that gives you that feeling. It just kind of comes, uh, and it's there, and that's what I felt a lot in this house. And like I said, and the idea also that Beau has a goal here, so Beau is trying to get out of this house. And it's like, in the scenario on the surface, it's Nathan Lane saying, oh no, you can stay as long as you want. And it's like, it's nice, and you acknowledge these are so nice and generous people, but it's the last thing you want to hear. The thing that you want is to just get out of this place. And just things keep happening that keep preventing him from leaving. And it's this feeling of being trapped in this place that's so almost overly nice. It's unsettling. And like I said, it's just this constant feeling of... This is something that's portrayed also later in the follow-up segment to this, which is the feeling that when you have this crippling anxiety 24 hours a day, there is no sanctuary. And it can feel like you've reached sanctuary or you've reached contentment, but there's always this constant feeling that it doesn't last. Like, there's always going to be something that interrupts. You're never allowed to stay in sanctuary or stay in contentment. There's always going to be something. And that's where a lot of this comes in also, in this middle portion. That also goes a lot into, like, the existential fears, as we get this really long sequence that kind of goes into animation, this very odd sort of animation combined with, live action actors. And while I love what that's conveying here, like I said, it gave me that vibe of and there's a carryover character that comes from the scenes at Nathan Lane's house that's going to eventually interrupt this sanctuary, and we know that it's coming, but this sanctuary starts to it lures you in with comfort, and people are taking him in. Haley Squires is the one that kind of brings him in. And then, like I said, it's like everybody's just sort of calm and getting along here. They're putting on a play and all that. But then, like I said, while this threat is already on its way, and we know that, and we know that we can't get that out of our minds, so we're never going to relax in this sanctuary, the play they're putting on is, like I said, takes us to this existential place, and that takes us into a whole other path. And it's at this point where I feel like this movie is nearly perfect. And I think the only reason it isn't perfect is because this middle portion, I think, goes on a bit longer after I kind of felt what the point of it was. So there's that, but that is what it is. But then, as it goes on, then we get into more of the stuff about, like, his mom and the Parker Posey stuff and stuff like that. And here's the thing, I think the reason, you would think, like, maybe I would hate this movie because of how vividly it makes me feel this, but weirdly enough, seeing this movie express the things that that I've always felt but never been able to put into words, it was really cathartic seeing this movie, where it's like, holy shit, somebody like really gets it. And I know you hear all the time about people who say they have, you know, constant anxiety and they're always worried about everything and all that, and how like, you know, insomnia is like through the roof with stuff like this and all of it. My vertigo gets insane too when I get really stressed out. That was happening a lot, especially lately. And it's like the way a movie can just show this visually, and with a character, where a performance like Joaquin Phoenix's through this character can convey just that constant fear. And it's like there's never, you really get the sense that Joaquin Phoenix knows this place very well. And like he and Ari Aster were really able to sort of come to this place that's very hard to reach, and we're able to bring these feelings to life. And like I said, it felt like freeing watching this in a way where, and I don't know if it's just, you know, like watching somebody else go through your pain, especially for 3 hours. But yeah, it's the idea that like, oh, like there is a way to explain it. Like a way to explain it exists, and Ari Aster found it and made it into this movie, and did it, like I said, mostly through visuals and situations. And that was just, I found that really comforting, despite how uncomfortable the movie is. And that's, yeah, and the way also, I think it's also freeing from the point of looking at it from a filmmaker's perspective, like Ari Aster, where it's when you're able to convey feelings like this and kind of tell a story through that, and it like where it goes outside the confines of like conventional, you know, storytelling, and not just storytelling, conventional logic in general. And it's like you can just create feelings when you go scene by scene. Because everybody that watches movies now is so locked into this everything has to be logical and set in this world kind of thing. So also seeing movies like this is just like, it just feels free to just feel what it's feeling and not have to worry about that. And like I said, that probably comes in why a lot of people don't like it. But it's the way it's able to just be what it is and make those feelings happen, without having to necessarily be this sort of linear story or whatever. I mean, we've seen, you know, like, you know, going outside the conventions of storytelling and stuff like that to convey feelings. It's not a new thing or anything, but to do it on this sort of scale, and to you know, convey the feelings that it is, that I feel like would have been impossible, to just get out there. And it's, yeah, and it's like I said, even if there's stuff that I don't relate to, there's still, I still feel like I get it by this point. To where he has me enough in his mindset to where we've had enough common ground to where I can say, oh, I can see where fears like this are real, and then seeing how they're blown up in these very fantastical ways, sometimes horrifying ways, sometimes unfathomable and indescribable ways. And it's really, Aster's really, we knew Ari Aster was a genius when we saw the opening shot of Hereditary. And it's like, this is a guy that knows things on a visual scale and can convey them in ways that you would have not thought were possible, and he can accomplish them through film. And it's, wow, there's another character in here, that I really, really appreciate. And this might sound like a detour, but I promise we're coming back around. There is a therapist, at the beginning and possibly later, played by Stephen Henderson, and Stephen Henderson is this very sort of, he has this very comforting sort of presence. He has like this teddy bear kind of quality, and he always plays like these sort of, you know, warm people that feel very real, is what he's really good at. And so he's playing this therapist for Beau in the opening scene, and the thing about it is, so many people talk about how helpful and amazing therapy is, and I definitely would never want to discredit those people, because I'm sure for so many people it works so well, and I can I can even understand why it's so beneficial and why it works so well for most people. But the last time I got evaluated was 10 years ago, and the conclusion that they came to was a whole list of phobias, and they were just kind of reading them off and kind of saying vaguely what they were. A lot of them I can't remember. I couldn't even pronounce at the time some of them, but they when they were describing what they were, they all made sense to me. And then that led to see a psychiatrist. Here's the door. And the thing about it was, many of these fears are socially related. So the idea of, oh, the cure for these anxieties is to pay out the ass to tell a complete stranger about all of them in very great and specific detail for however many sessions, and that was and still is an insane thought to me. For somebody like I said, I completely understand how it works for other people. It's an insane thought to me. Like, to imagine me doing that is something I just can't even go there. So my first thought seeing Steven Henderson was like, oh, but Beau's seeing a therapist. That's interesting. I don't know if I would have suspected that or not, if he's afraid of everything. So what the genius thing about this is the casting of Steven Henderson, who is normally this very warm and authentic and comforting presence, playing the therapist. Because that's like, yeah, if I were to have a therapist, I'd probably want somebody that is like a character Steven Henderson would play. But even with that casting, there's something off about the therapist. And like, sometimes they get really subtle with it, where it's like, I don't know about the therapist. And then it becomes more and more not so subtle as it goes, that even the therapist is off. So from my standpoint on that, I really appreciated that too. So, and that's, I think, as far as like, the shots and stuff like that. I do love what this movie is able to fit like into one shot, specifically using like windows or mirrors or something, where like there's a character off screen, but we see the reflection in a mirror still, and everything's all on the wide shot. Or somebody goes outside, but we're still inside, but like a whole scene happens through a window while we're still like in an interior. And like I said, just his whole career, even with just 3 movies, it feels like Astor's had a whole career at this point. Like a whole complete career at this point, especially after a movie like this. This is the kind of movie filmmakers make at the end of their run, where it's like the culmination of everything they've done and everything in their entire life. And it's his 3rd movie. And I want to say he's still relatively young. I don't know. He looks relatively young, but I'm not sure exactly how old he is. But he's accomplished a lot already. And it's like, if this is his 3rd, like, what's he gonna follow this with? And you would think that's like is he gonna peak here? But I have no intentions of underestimating Ari Aster at this point. So, I don't know what the hell is gonna come next, but especially after this. But I will say, like I said, it's one thing that this movie is just really well made, but it's like, when it can make you feel this way, I don't know what else I can really say apart from what I've already said. But when a movie can just hit you in a really specific way like this, and do it for nearly 3 hours, is pretty stunning. So props to everybody that was involved, every fucking buddy that was involved in this. Yeah, I'm very grateful that this movie exists, as wild and uncomfortable and weird as it is. That's all the more reason for me to love it. So, the next thing, speaking of genital-themed movies, let's go to No Hard Feelings, which is totally different now. We gotta come down from Beau Is Afraid. And so, with No Hard Feelings, one thing that was immediately talked about as far as this movie's existence was the sort of absence of, these big comedies that used to be in theaters all the time, and how comedies have kind of gone straight to streaming now and stuff like that, and these raunchy R-rated comedies like this, which always are kind of part of their era, but lately it does kind of seem like we're more in this vein of trying to capture previous eras instead of being more about this era. So this one is clearly trying to be like half John Hughes, half, the just the comedies of the 80s that existed just to be raunchy. So like it's trying to have a heart, but it's also trying to be like this big over the top, creating classic moments comedy, and it kind of gets a bit twisted in itself. But as far as like the concept, because the concept did kind of stir some controversy when it was coming out, where Lawrence is my age, so it's but I guess she's old now. At least through the eyes of like what would be a younger audience or a younger demographic. So she's seen as this older woman that is caught in this place where she needs money, and so she answers this ad from Matthew Broderick to essentially seduce his 19-year-old son, so that he can be out of his shell by the time he gets to college. And the idea of people were upset about this kind of having a predatory nature to it, but as far as that's concerned, I think the twisted nature of the setup is where they're kind of trying to mine the comedy out of it. So that's if you can take it as that, then you may not get hung up on that. I don't know, because I'm somebody that's still hung up on Licorice Pizza being uncomfortable, but he's fucking 15 in Licorice Pizza. That's still weird to me. So here, the thing about it, where the comedy comes from, is that first of all, as far as Jennifer Lawrence being Jennifer Lawrence and being like super attractive and hot and stuff like that, that's also something where it would just kind of like they're kind of using that to almost sort of sell it, and that's basically how we're supposed to see that character. But the thing here that they're doing is that's where a lot of the comedy comes from, the fact that she's hot, because the guy's not into her, and he's a 19-year-old guy. You're gonna probably be into Jennifer Lawrence, especially if she's throwing herself at you. So the idea that she's doing it for the money, but she doesn't really, well, she's doing it for a car actually. But so she's not like wanting to do it. She's in a place where she feels like she has to do it, and he doesn't want this at all. So the fact that she's hot and throwing herself at a younger guy who would dream of this, it is funny in concept that neither one of them actually wants this at all. So that in itself, I feel like, is a good setup, and it sets up this good way to where Lawrence can show, what comedy she can bring to a role and bring to a movie, while also using her strengths that we know she has, and strengths that maybe we didn't know she had as much of. Despite the fact that she has done quite a bit, her Oscar-winning role really has mostly comedy in it. But this is a different kind of thing, where it's like, while those movies were kind of prestige movies, this is just they wanted to make like a movie that you would find in the 80s. And I don't know how much it works, because the characters are likable enough, both of them really, and we kind of get where both of their directions are coming from, even though it might seem like on the surface she's not that likable, and she's not intended to be likable, but she just kind of wins us over. But there's something between them that's kind of sweet, and I think that comes from the funny awkwardness of it, and the fact that neither one of them really wants this that much, and how they take what would otherwise be sexy and make it pretty unsexy in this sort of comedic way. There's one particular moment when she goes to give him a lap dance, and then she tries to switch this, and she's like, she wants him to give her a lap dance, and it turns into like this. She looks like she's bouncing a baby on her knee, which is a very funny image, and like I said, but the context works. But apart from that, and apart from a line here and there, the biggest problem with the movie for me is just that I didn't think it was that funny. Like it's weird how you can go to a comedy and you can like the characters, you can be good with the setup, and you feel like it has strong potential as a setup, and then, things play out like you would expect them to do with this concept, like they use the concept, but yet the laughs aren't coming. It's like, it looks like it works. Like, everything about the pieces moving looks like it works, But yet, at the end of the day, I just didn't really find it funny, which was really weird and jarring. Like I said, every now and then there's like a line that comes in, like when she goes in to adopt a dog. That's like the facade of her starting this. And he says, "Why do you want to adopt a dog?" And she says, "I can't have any of my own." And it's like, that's, yeah, that's a that's a funny line. But apart from little moments like that, like the big things, just didn't really feel like they were hitting. And I guess it kind of felt like they were trying to make them big things. They were trying to make memorable scenes and classic scenes. And that's not something you can force. It's just kind of something that happens. And I think that's where they fell short. There's also some jokes where it's like they try to take one thing and make multiple comedic aspects out of it, but I can see where that would work too, but it just kind of feels like it's repetitive, like it's like the fact that she has to rollerblade because her car gets towed. And they try to get so many different comedic beats out of the fact that she's rollerblading. There's the initial cut to them where she doesn't have a car and we know this, so when it cuts to her just rollerblading, that's supposed to be funny in itself, like a funny reveal. But then they do another bit where she tries to drive in the rollerblades, which obviously is going to go horribly wrong. That's a comedic beat. When she goes to meet the kid for the first time, she's wearing a dress. I think it's supposed to be a comedic beat that, like, she's wearing this nice dress, but then she's also rollerblading. And then, when she gets to the house, obviously they're rich, so it's a big house. So she's trying to get up this big staircase in the rollerblades. You'd think she'd take them off by this point, but comedy, I guess. And that's... Oh, she also has to struggle to get up a hill on the rollerblades. So many consecutive jokes about the rollerblades. And it's like, that's... They really went all in on that, which was kind of an odd move, but... as far as everything else goes, like I said, as far as them using what were the controversial aspects and making them actually comedic aspects, there's something clever in this movie, but still, even when they turn things on their heads, they end up writing themselves into a corner, because we get to that age-old problem with comedies, especially today, and that's where I felt like it was really easy to get sick of comedies. That just kind of weren't working, where it was... We reached this point for a while where we were in, like, our Apatow phase, and that's, like pretty much all comedies at one point, all successful comedies at one point, were somehow either Apatow-related movies or, like, distant descendants of Apatow. And we hit a stride, but in a lot of those movies, like, what Apatow's kind of trademark was they start as comedies and they basically end up as dramas. And we talked before about John Hughes probably being an inspiration for this, but we've also talked about how John Hughes was like a master, like it was John Hughes' thing to turn, where his comedies had very dramatic beats, and he was telling stories about very real characters in very real situations, and were very relatable, and that's why they stand the test of time. We just talked about Ferris Bueller in depth about this. But then it's also trying to be like the 80s comedy where there wasn't much of that. There was barely a plot. It was just kind of all about the jokes. And both of these have their place. But at a point in time, when you reach a big enough place where the jokes are going as big as they are here, it's like eventually there's a point of no return to coming back to a drama. And where it's like it feels like you're watching two totally different movies from two totally different scripts. And this is one of those where, because first of all, actually, the first big conflict here, both within the characters and with the movie itself, is that she starts having feelings for him. And once again, you can see where this is kind of a turnaround, where this is turning the concept on its head, because you would think in any other movie, especially in the movies that it's kind of inspired by, it's going to be the guy that falls for the girl, and the girl is kind of fending him off. And how now it's the other way around, where he's the one that doesn't want it, he's trying to fend her off, and she's the one that starts having feelings, and he doesn't. And they play that up like it's this big turning everything on its head thing, but then he does get feelings, and then the fact that he gets feelings, because it gets especially weird when she gets super... Well, she gets like super jealous and possessive of him when this other girl that he actually likes and actually likes him comes into it. And you could say that it's because she wants the car and this girl would be messing that up. Because she's got to sleep with him in order to get the car from Matthew Broderick. But it also seems to really be playing up that her feelings are sincere. So I don't know what we're supposed to think about those. And it gets kind of weird. But then, inevitably, because he does have feelings, because the script wants him to, we get to this place where he's going to find out that this was a ruse. It's inevitable he's going to find out that this was a deal between his parents and her. And this happens way early, way too early. So this whole conflict where he's sulking and he's avoiding her and doing all that is like the entire last third. It feels like it goes on forever. This downside where she has to come to terms with growing up and being more mature and like, finding a relationship that matters and not pushing people away. And he's got to come to terms with, like, oh, she didn't really feel that way, but maybe she feels something, and there's, and coming out of his shell and all that, and his parents sheltering him and them sorting, it's a lot of fucking conflict for a movie that's trying to be a big comedy. It gets so wrapped up in its conflicts that you almost start to forget it was a comedy to begin with, despite how big it was trying to go. And that's always the death knell for these sort of post, Apatow movies. And it's like they all fell into that trap, and we didn't have movies that were just about the jokes anymore, which just seems like what it was trying to go back to. That was the whole point of doing a raunchy R-rated comedy and putting it in theaters and trying to make it some big hit. Having an Oscar winner as the star of it, and I don't know, it just, there was way, like I said, all of this is a problem as it is. That's not even to mention what I started with, which was the comedic moments aren't even that funny. They're just like, you can acknowledge that they work on paper as comedic moments, but like I said, the laughs aren't there. So I don't think I think, with the exception of that one dog line, which is a throwaway line, I think any laugh that came out of me felt a little forced. And that's, yeah, I don't think that's the feeling they intended. So that's basically how I feel about this. Like I said, it's a nice attempt to try to resurrect this kind of comedy, but it just fell right into the same traps that we just left behind. So that's unfortunate and does feel like quite a bit of wasted potential. So let's go back to a movie that I love. We're back to I feel more passionate about these next two. Let's start with BlackBerry, where I just got done talking about how old I feel because Jennifer Lawrence is now considered old in the eyes of a demographic. Now we're in BlackBerry, where 1996 is supposed to be like really nostalgic, and it's kind of taking us back to a place where it's like the way we were seeing a lot of 80s nostalgia recently, we've now reached the point where 90s are going to start being treated like that. But what I love about that, the I feel old thing is just a thing. It's really well done as far as the portraying like the 90s as this past era. But the way they also make the movie visually look like it's from a different time, and like when we have like the opening credits where we'll see like movie clips and like recorded VHSs and stuff like that, it like does a great way. It's a great way of like setting us in this place, and kind of taking us back to 96. And so even though I was like 6 at the time, still I have pretty vivid memories of 1996. And yeah, this handles those pretty well, and it doesn't it doesn't rely on that. It's just the setting, and I really like the way that was done. So I also love the way these early scenes are handled without a lot of blatant exposition, because obviously this is going to be a movie that's like almost all dialogue, and it's going to kind of be them explaining what's happening and how things work and stuff like that. But for a movie like this, you need that, obviously, because it's what the movie is. It's the matter of taking that dialogue and those explanations and putting it into a style that the movie does so incredible. It keeps you so engaged for the entire 2 hours by the way they really sort of stylize this stuff that you would think would be boring on the surface, or if you just hear like, oh, it's a a movie about BlackBerry, which I've talked many times before now as we're getting into these movies like Air and stuff like that, where I just hate the shallow way people just see these movies where it's like, oh, it's a movie about Nike, who cares, and oh, it's a movie about BlackBerry, who cares, and it's like I feel like ever since at least The Social Network, we're past this, where it's like once we got past the oh, it's a Facebook movie, what's that gonna be, and it's the fucking Social Network, that should have ended any sort of, oh, I don't care because it's about this thing, supposedly, whatever. But, yeah, but anyway, about the exposition. To introduce the characters, though, you're going to need some backstory. And I like the way they do that, like, especially with Baruchel's character. Jay Baruchel's character, who basically sets off the whole BlackBerry thing. And it's... we see him sort of working, and like pretty much just as you're thinking like, oh, what's, if you don't know, like, well, what's this guy's backstory, and then the camera just kind of focuses in the same shot on a newspaper article that says basically where he's coming from and how he got to this point, and it's so smooth. It's and the way they use the visual cues like that to kind of tell the story, to set the scene, with that and the 90s montage and all that, is so well done and such a great introduction, because we're thrust into the movie pretty immediately. Like, I knew the movie was starting right away when we met Glenn Howerton's character. I mean, we meet Glenn Howerton's character before the opening credits, and that's where it was like, okay, I feel like we're setting a sort of speed here, we're setting a pace here, and this is going to be what it is, and it's going to be great. Now, the thing about it is, I've actually seen BlackBerry twice. I saw it at the theater, and I really, really liked it, but I don't think I loved it until I saw it again a second time, and I kind of knew where it was going. Like, obviously everybody knows the outcome of BlackBerry, but when you see how it got to that point, that's what the real strength of the story is. And when I got the vibe of that, like, it almost actually helps movies like this when you know where they're going, and you know what the outcome is. Because then you can see just how well paced and how well put together the journey there is, and how they find ways to ramp up the tension and keep your interest nonstop. And I really love it. Now would be a good time to shout out the director and co-writer Matt Johnson, who made a movie 10 years ago called The Dirties. Actually, he made it longer ago than that, but it came out 10 years ago. And we talked about The Dirties on this channel when it came out, because we're that fucking old. And the thing about it was, I don't think I was kind to that movie, but I don't think I got what I was expecting out of that movie, which is why. But now that I've seen him do this, and now The Dirties has kind of gotten this sort of following as it's gone on, it's definitely a movie I want to go back to, and I hope to do that very soon, because I feel like there's probably a lot more in there that I wasn't getting at the time. And it's like, now that I've got a grasp on how he's sort of progressed as a filmmaker, I would love to go back to The Dirties and see how much it holds up now. And he's also not only playing those crucial parts, but he's also the sort of third main character here, Doug, where he gives... all three core performances here are great. But to talk about his performance here as Doug, I love that he betrays him in this way to where he seems sort of like man-child, like where they all seem sort of man-child-like. But at the same time, they're likable characters, and they're funny characters, and they're very smart characters. But at the same time, when Glenn Howerton comes into this story, and he kind of starts to take over from a full-on, no bullshit business perspective, you understand where his frustration comes from with these people, especially like Doug. But it's like the fact that those don't really clash. Like, we can understand Jim, the Howerton character's perspective on how he feels about these people, but we as the audience never like them any less. But even though we can understand Howerton's frustration, and I feel like that was played in this very balanced way that must have been very difficult to pull off. But the whole movie feels so effortless, as far as like how they were able to tell the story that they were going to tell. It feels like this is one of those movies where it can feel in the movie like it's sort of chaotic and everybody's sort of out of their minds, but yet it took a very precise level of filmmaking in order to get to this point, that the that Johnson and the crew knew exactly what they were doing. I was listening to or I was watching the Always Sunny podcast where Howerton was talking about this at length. And one of the great things he talked about was how all the cameras were like from a distance with like long lenses. So he would walk onto set and he wouldn't even know where the cameras were. And it's like, just when he talks about just the environment that was on that set, it sounds like so, not just like collaborative and creative and stuff like that, but like I said, how they seem to know precisely how they wanted to make it, and that really comes through. And there's even moments where, like this sort of, I think the term controlled chaos even came up. But they also used a gimbal, where it's like where the camera looks like it's like handheld and like kind of shaky, but it's not handheld and it's actually completely in control, and all of that is intentional. And it's like, so all of that, just from a filmmaking perspective, the movie just looks amazing. But then to talk about these characters, before we get more into Howerton, to talk about Baruchel, who's obviously like sort of the main part here, just right away, because I haven't praised Jay Baruchel a lot over the years, but here in particular, I think what makes this performance especially so strong is how it evolves, because the movie's set over a number of years. Where he's at the start of this, and he kind of has this timid quality to him, where he's like the quiet genius of the group. But he just needs a direction. He needs a character like Jim to really put their foot down and put him on a specific path. But then he gets to this point where, as he evolves and as he sort of gets more as they get more successful, he does become more, as he becomes more powerful, he becomes more about cracking down and stuff like that. And the way we see the changes in his character, but at the same time, the stuff that stays exactly the same. And it's like how you can see this is a guy that's been through the years, where there's pieces of him that have changed and pieces that haven't. And the way Baruchel was able to play that and make us feel that for this character. And also, once again, like Doug, like there's this sympathetic quality where we understand how they've gotten to the places they've gotten, and like things may have gotten out of control. We can understand where the downfall came. Like we can see the downfall and where it came from, and we know exactly what it was. But there's still something where you feel for these guys, and you really wish you could see them succeed, even though we know the outcome already. And the way he can play it like across a grand scale like that, but also the little moments. Also, there's one moment that's perfect, where he has this presentation, and it's basically like this big turning moment for everything. It's basically a turning moment for everybody's lives. And after he's given this big giant pitch and this big giant speech, he hiccups, and and it's so out of left field. It feels so like authentic, like it's something that just happened, and it's something you can definitely get the vibe of that has to be something that really happened, because it's so specific and so right and so perfectly timed. It has to be something that happened to the real guy, or something that happened to Jay Baruchel on set that they kept in. Either one is completely believable, and it's perfect. So to talk about that. And also the dialogue where he's explaining everything and like the tech aspect of things. This goes into the writing also, but also the way Baruchel has to deliver it, especially at rapid fire. The way when it talks about the tech aspect, and it's like stuff that you probably don't understand at all, but the movie is well structured enough that you don't really have to understand it. You can still get it, and the scenes still have the punch and the power that they do when they reach their key moments, and you understand just enough. So I feel like that both those things working together plays a big part in that. And to talk about Howerton, and to talk about everybody, another thing that's great about this is how funny the movie is, how consistently funny the movie is, which is another thing that's gonna bring it to life if you're concerned about, is a movie about the BlackBerry gonna be entertaining enough. And it's like, yeah, on top of the filmmaking and the performances, yeah, it's also consistently funny throughout. And I think what especially makes it so funny, and something they really found and knew was like going to be a core thing to this movie, is that all these characters that you might laugh hysterically at what's happening and what they're saying, none of these characters at any moment think they're being funny or do things to be funny. It's just the way they genuinely react to things or the way they genuinely speak to each other will just be inherently funny, sometimes inherently hysterical. And like I said, nobody in this movie thinks they're in a comedy. And that's something that's going to be really... Like, the way everything is played so straight, especially Howerton, where Howerton is just constantly angry. And that's another one of those things also where angry funny can be hard to do. It's something that you see a lot, where you see somebody really get worked up, but it can also feel really manufactured, at least to me, I think. So I always take it with a grain of salt whenever I see somebody getting, more and more amped up and ranty. And it's like, oh, they're going for that sort of, angry funny. But there's something that comes so naturally to Howerton for this. Because you would think, obviously a big discussion is going to be how much Dennis is in Jim, his Always Sunny character. And the thing about it is, you can see the roots of his performance throughout It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia here, where Dennis is a character whose anger is hilarious, and that's a big character trait for him. But once again, Jim is a totally different character. Not only is Jim a real person, but there's also... The way I've described it a number of times is, it's like taking Justin Timberlake's character in The Social Network and putting him in an Armando Iannucci movie. The guy that made In the Loop and The Death of Stalin. The guy that made famous Peter Capaldi being constantly angry and hurling insults at rapid fire. And it's like, that's what it feels like a Capaldi performance, which is a massive compliment. But at the same time, also, it doesn't feel like it's trying to be anything else. That's just something I can compare it to in my mind, where it's like, this succeeds in the same way that thing succeeds, but it's not the same thing necessarily. So, like, as far as Jim feeling like this very grounded character, what's very interesting about him is when we see the way that he started and we see his determination, where even though he might seem like a giant dick, and he is a giant dick, for somehow, some way, there's this charm, I think, that Glenn Howerton has, in particular, that maybe Jim doesn't have, but Howerton has it, where somehow you don't want to see this guy fail. Like, when he walks into a pitch, like when he walks into the pitch with Saul Rubick, which is a really key scene and a great scene, one of my favorite scenes in the movie, you want this to go well, even though you know this guy is a dick. And he might seem like, he's way over the top with his anger, but like I was saying before with Doug, it's pretty easy to see where all of his frustrations come from, even though he seems like one of those over-the-top angry characters, and is funny because of how over-the-top angry he is. But he has a reason to be the way he is for most of the movie. And what makes this a really interesting dynamic is that watching him and hoping he succeeds in these particular endeavors and getting entertainment out of his character, it's just as exciting to watch him dig himself into holes throughout this. Where it's like, through his arrogance and his pettiness, he's just really digging himself into really deep holes throughout this. And I think not only is it entertaining because it feels like a bit of comeuppance because he's a dick, but seeing how he's going to try to get himself out of them. And it's like, whether he actually succeeds at that or not, watching him try is a massively entertaining part of this movie. And it's like, especially when he's like under time crunches, where he's trying to do these really big tasks that require flying to different places. And there's a point in time where he has to be in 2 different places at once, where he's going to have to take a plane to do that. And he comes to the conclusion, I'm just going to do both today, right now. And it's like, then the movie reaches a stride at that point, too, where the movie is already great, because this is like kind of rolling into the third act, but the whole movie kind of has a stride like that, where it really starts to take off in the third act. And I think that also, what makes that great is, when I said that I liked this the first time, but I didn't love it like I do now, was, I thought when we got to the third act, we started to have a pacing issue, especially when we start time jumping into further years, like when we get to 2003 and, 2007 and stuff like that. But the thing here, the problem that was not a problem the second time I saw it was I was talking about Air and how much I really, 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 really loved Air. So I had. It wasn't long after I saw Air that I went and saw this at the theater. I saw them both in the theater actually, and I was so high on Air and Air's pacing at the time that by comparison I felt like this wasn't really matching up to that, kind of rolling into its third act, and that's just not what you just don't want to do that. Like comparing two movies, even though the movies kind of have similar vibes, they're just not the same thing, and they don't gather momentum in the same ways. And so when I didn't have Air freshly in the back of my mind, and I watched BlackBerry again, this third act was one of my favorite parts. And it's like the way it was rolling along. And like I said, I think it helps also to actually know where it's going. At least for me, it helped to know where it was going. And it was like, oh, but he's still got to do this. He's got to try to do this. They got to get to this point. And then watching that roll along was a much more satisfying experience. So, yeah, don't try to keep a movie in your head that's also... Because honestly, as time has gone on, I now think I might prefer this to Air. I don't know, but that's like I said, that's opening up that whole can of worms that I don't even want to go into, and I'm trying to tell you not to do too. So we won't go down that road. But that's another thing too, though, is also comparing. Like I was talking about Howerton and Capaldi, and how I'm not comparing their performances specifically. Like I was talking about The Social Network, and how you could say this movie is very, very, very comparable to The Social Network when you look at the structure of it. And you've got, how Baruchel is very much like, a Zuckerberg in this situation, and he's, taken under the wing of, eventually under the control of, it feels like, Justin Timberlake's character, Sean Parker, and how Howerton does the same thing here, where it's like, he's coming in, he forces himself as basically part of the business, and then is basically running things with the face of, in the Social Network's case, Zuckerberg, in this case, Jay Baruchel's character. And then you have the character who was here all along, and the character that's always been loyal, and the character that, was basically the best friend of the main character with Eduardo in the Social Network, and now Doug here. And so with that in mind, you would think, oh, I can't stop thinking about the Social Network when I watch BlackBerry. And that's not the case at all. Once again, I can relate them in my mind, but what's less about that is it almost enhances it in a way to where it's like, knowing that both of these are true stories and these are basically how they played out in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of this... they make nice companions in the sense of history repeating itself, which I found really interesting also. So it's like it almost like accidentally connects to that movie, but it only kind of further adds to a point that this movie is telling. So... And the idea about the dynamics between businesses like this, and how what can happen to friendships, and what can happen with power and money and all that, and success. And it's ultimately it's just a really satisfying movie and a really satisfying experience. Also, one thing I didn't mention was the use of like music in movies also is really well done. Where like they have movie nights, and that's kind of how they get going, and that's kind of how they bond too. They watch like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and there's a great moment where the soundtrack to the original Ninja Turtles movie comes in, a soundtrack that I know very well. And so when there's a moment where Doug's driving to work and he's listening to the soundtrack, and he's listening to the MC Hammer song, and the idea of... Not only is it a great moment that sets up, like, this is where he is, like, this is that sort of man-child quality we were talking about, where there's going to be a movie night, even though they don't say it explicitly, it's clear the movie of the night probably would have been the Ninja Turtles movie, and this is the way he amped up with it. But there's also this great moment where the song continues through the scene, because it starts with him playing it in his car, and then he like, switches it to his Walkman, and then gets out and walks into the office. And because of that, because it's a tape, the song is just continuous through the scene, from his car to his Walkman as he's going in. And so stuff like that I really appreciate it also, where it's like, you can set the era with movies and music and stuff like that and make it really obvious and overbearing, or you can do it like this, and it's really clever and actually kind of funny in a way too. So yeah, they did. Everybody once again did a fantastic job on this, and I'm really satisfied with that. Like I said, don't let it hold you back that it's a movie about BlackBerry, because most of the movies like this are worth seeing. Stuff like this, stuff like Air, stuff like The Social Network. It's yeah. So don't avoid movies like this if you can, and it's as long as they're of this quality. So um, now we can go on to Past Lives, and this was a movie that it was difficult to come into because there was a lot of hype behind it. There's like all the Oscar buzz, there was the festival buzz around it, and this is the point in time where we're getting to movies that have a lot to live up to. And with this one, what's great about this is I felt like it was kind of irrelevant after a while, because this movie is so easy to sort of fall into. Like, this movie just kind of takes you gently along into it and engrosses you, and especially in its characters. But they do something ingenious. Celine Song, who wrote and directed the movie, did this, which is the opening scene where we see our three main characters, and they're sitting at a bar, and we as the audience don't know how they're connected. And there are these unseen characters we're kind of looking through the perspective of that don't know these people either. And they're doing what you would probably do at a bar, especially if it's as late as they say it was, which is, it seems odd where it's, two Korean people and then an American white guy, and they're trying to figure out how these people possibly relate and like how they know each other. And it's like they're basically doing exactly what the audience would be doing if this was a quiet shot that was just looking at them silently. But the idea of like seeing it through other people's perspectives, I feel like really sets the audience in a certain mindset and like gets us there to a place immediately. And it might seem like, oh, is the movie just going to spell everything out for us? No, it's as far as that, it's kind of the opposite, where a lot of this movie is understood silences and body language and watching the way people react to each other and look at each other. And so I feel like that's, yeah, as far as like setting the scene, I just kind of love how that comes together, and how once it gets us in a perspective, we can go by ourselves and we've got it essentially. And so what I really like about this movie is, as far as the way it treats like love in this really real sort of way, in a way that they dance around that word like the whole movie pretty much, which is really clever. But the idea of this movie starting as one thing and then kind of being another thing until it's another thing, where it's like essentially in three segments. And the thing about it is, in this first segment, there are children that are going to school together, and they have a bond. And we see what appears to be like, they're at that age where it's like we as an audience look at them and we know it's probably love, but they're probably young enough that they don't quite know that. They know what they feel, but they might not know that that's what it is. And then that's our first portion, and it's like, if the movie was like just that, this would probably be a really good and like gentle yet powerful movie. And then there's the middle section where they've had to she immigrates to Canada, so they've gone their separate ways. And as they're approaching adulthood, they sort of, as they're in, early adulthood, they discover each other on social media, or they get the idea to look for each other, and then they find each other through social media. And then I stopped again and I was like, if this was the whole movie, if it was them, confiding in others about each other and wondering about what the other one has been up to all these years, and then started to look through for each other through social media, that as a movie by itself would work as a whole. And then when they do discover each other, they talk through Skype, and it kind of becomes this series of Skype calls as they sort of reconnect, and we can see that even through Skype calls we can see the connection and feel the connection. That by itself would be something really good and really powerful. But it's like it continues, and the relationship evolves in these ways, to where we're jumping 12 years at a time. And that's something that sort of sets it on this seemingly grand scale, but the movie feels so small and genuine, but it's like, but the power is still there, the same as if it were an epic. Like, the movie feels very short, and I think that's another thing as far as like the pacing goes, where not only is it good when a movie feels like it's flowing well and eventually feels short once it ends, where you're like, wow, that was it already. As the emotions kind of catch up to you, you realize just how efficient and strong it was throughout every moment that it had. Like, it used every single moment that it had. But another reason the pacing works like that is the idea of, we talked about this recently for another movie, where when time feels like it's flying when you're talking to somebody that you care about. And so when we have these moments when the time goes by and the years go by, when they're spending it with the people they love, it goes by significantly quicker. And so to kind of put that where it feels like that in the movie itself, how, like, when you get to the end of the movie, it feels like you've spent time with people that you care about. Thus, the movie feels very short. But then there's another thing here where you might think, how when you're dealing with this, and like in the Skype stuff and stuff like that, sometimes it feels maybe a bit montagey, and it's like, are we fast forwarding through the good bits? But no, there's a lot of real conversations in here, and also, like, especially like as far as when I say real conversations, I mean, like, obviously the more they talk, the more comfortable they get with each other, and even with Skype, there's going to be this sort of unnatural way about it, but yeah, we have those moments where there's pauses that feel really real, or like there's maybe an uncomfortable silence, but then those uncomfortable silences eventually become comfortable silences, that you can have. And it's like the way we see it progress in these very sort of quick moments in the movie, the whole relationship feels like it's there. And then the idea of, is it a relationship or isn't it, is kind of a question of the whole movie, but we're going to say that for argument's sake. And that's the thing, is like, even despite the long distance, there's something there that's, because here's the thing, is when this third character comes in, the John Magara character, who ultimately, you know, who she gets into a couple with, there is this feeling where there's also something very lived in about them, especially through the time jumps. And it's the idea of having this very, this particular connection that's very specific to that person. But when we see the connection with his character Arthur, and when we see the connection with, her childhood love, it's clear that there is a difference. Like, we can understand that she and Arthur clearly love each other, and if we were just to watch their story through the years, we'd probably never question that. But with what we know, there's something there between them that's not quite the same feeling with Arthur, and we get that. But the thing about it is, you can ask the question, and they ask the questions of, like, is it just that feeling of the past, where it's like, where we kind of see the relationship between them when they're kids, and then the Skype calls, and then to now. And we don't see the relationship with Arthur as clearly. Like, we kind of get snippets of her relationship with Arthur, and then in the time jump tells us everything, basically, about their relationship in a very concise way. But still, there's something here where all of the characters feel like, we feel something for all the characters. Where, like, this is a very heartbreaking situation where maybe she has this everlasting love for this one person, but she's also with this other person she's been living a long life with, that she's also happy with, and it's at this point a movie would usually try to get you to take sides and want one person to end up with another, and as this definitive thing. But the great thing about this movie is that your heart kind of breaks for everybody. And it's like you're happy for all the love this year, because there's a lot of love present, but because of the situation, there's also a lot of heartbreak here also, and the fact that you can feel it for all three characters equally, and a lot of that also has to do with some really beautiful stuff that John Magaro does in kind of the second half here, where he seems like a character that you could just write off, and he seems like a character that might just exist for conflict between this couple. But no, these are all very real people that have been living very, like, long, love-filled lives with each other. And there's this scene in particular when they're in bed, and like it's kind of like we finally get Arthur's point of view after a long time, and it might seem like, oh, it's maybe a little too, like, why wait so late to give us Arthur's perspective, but it's actually kind of perfectly timed, because it really sets up this whole thing, this whole dynamic of where does her heart lie, and it's like, is this just holding off until she can get this, but then it's like this whole turning point of, oh no, this is like a real life that she's living, and this is a life that she can be happy in, but it's like, where where is the heart ultimately going to fall? Can the heart land in two different places at once? And it's like the way it explores these feelings, though, it's like I said, it's so quiet and gentle about itself. I can't use those words enough to describe this, because when she does meet up with the other guy again after all these years, after the Skype calls and being separated as children, it's like that feeling between them and that chemistry between them almost immediately returns when they meet again. And it's like you can feel like it's going to be. It has a very before trilogy kind of feeling between them. Like there's a whole before trilogy happening with these people by way of long distance. Plus, there's a third character that we care just as much about involved in this, and that's, yeah. And the way also when we look at Arthur's perspective, how there's the language barrier, where it's like it almost feels like she's separating herself. She feels like she's separating herself from herself when she talks to him and realizes that she doesn't really speak Korean anymore, and she barely, aligns with the culture anymore. Um, and it's like her life, in Canada and stuff like that, is just everything has completely changed her as a person. And when she sees him, she comes back to this place, and it's like, is this who she really is, or is this who she really is? Again, can these things coexist? And like just so many complicated feelings. But like I said, hardly any of this is like outright explained to us. It's just all in the feelings and the body language and the looks and everything. Like I said, in this language barrier where Arthur can't really speak much Korean at all. So when the two of them can have conversations that Arthur doesn't understand, and he has like, actually, like it's this fear that lives inside him, and it's like this idea that she talks in her sleep, in Korean, even though she doesn't speak it much in her day to day life. And like just you can sense where everybody's coming from here, and it's like you want everybody to be happy, but you know that something's eventually going to have to be sacrificed. Heartbreak is going to be inevitable. Where it's like even if somebody ends up happy, the heartbreak is already kind of set itself in, because of just the situation itself, and you can just kind of see, like I said, everything is sort of laid out, but nothing feels blatant, which I really love. And so, as far as my general feelings about this movie, what's interesting about it is I was appreciating all this. And I was like, I was at that place where it was like, yeah, okay, I like this movie. It's very well made, very well done, very, very well performed. But I wonder if I'll actually feel the hype or not. I don't know. And it snuck up on me in this really weird way. There's like a moment, there's a couple of moments actually towards the end, and it's basically after the key scene has happened, like the big scene has happened, the big emotional scene, that you could call it that. It doesn't play itself off as a big emotional scene. This movie is very cool about itself, as far as how it displays its emotions, but cool in a good way. But there's a moment after the fact, and I felt like there was like I felt like, oh, that's effective, like, oh, that's actually, that could be moving, and I didn't know I was moved until I took a breath. I inhaled, and you know how when you're starting to get emotional and you like breathe in, your breath kind of does that shaking thing in your throat a little bit. I didn't know I was getting emotional watching these particular moments at the end, but then when I inhaled, that feeling came, and that's when I realized it was making me emotional. It was a really weird feeling how the movie just snuck up on me, and just and it's just yeah, that's yeah. So and that's basically the note that the movie goes out on. And so feeling that at the very end kind of made me immediately reevaluate the entire movie in my head, and I realized just like it wasn't just oh I appreciate the movie. I think I genuinely love the movie. And it kind of took that whole point to take everything back into a certain perspective, and so that's yeah. If this becomes a big award season movie like right now I'm thinking it could be, I definitely wish it all the best. So because it would very much be deserved. And shout out to Celine Song for making such a beautiful movie that feels so simple in a way, but like I said, just filled to the brim with complex feelings and emotions. And so to be able to balance that, to make it feel like one thing when it's really another, like that, simplicity and complexity just kind of working in harmony. It's yeah, it's fantastic. So let's end on "You Hurt My Feelings," which is Nicole Holofcener's new movie, and it's very much a Nicole Holofcener movie where we're dealing with characters that feel very like what I love about her movies is the fact that they could be about big things, but they feel very like past lives, but feel very small. And the fact that this might sound like a bad thing when you talk about filmmakers typically sort of evolve in their careers, but it's like I look at her earlier movies like Walking and Talking and Lovely and Amazing and stuff like that, and it's like when I see You Hurt My Feelings now in 2023, all these movies feel very much in line with each other. Like it's not necessarily like she's evolving as a filmmaker, but she's an extremely consistent one. But I don't think that's the negative that it sounds like, because there's just something very particular about her style where she has a way of bringing characters to life and feelings to life that we recognize and feel very real, and she doesn't have to like go out of her way to reach those feelings and to like introduce us to new characters that we can still relate to or still feel what they're feeling, which is especially a big theme in this movie. And what's interesting is there's a good 25 minutes. We're a good 25 minutes into the movie before the catalyst even really hits. And the movie's only an hour and a half. Her movies are very short and efficient. But we start off and we have Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who is a writer, and her husband, Tobias Menzies, who is this like couples counselor. And I think he's also like a therapist in general. But he has we can see this sort of contempt that he has for his job, and he may even be not very good at his job. And we get these through some of his clients, some of which are just sort of very passive aggressive. Then there's a couple that he's counseling who are in a funny turn of events, David Cross and Amber Tamblyn. And this couple is like the worst. And so we get these moments where he's eventually just by himself, and we get the sense that he feels he's surrounded by unhappy people. Most of the people in this movie are surrounded by unhappy people. And so when we see them as a married couple, he and Julia Louis-Dreyfus, they're quite happy together. They're like their bliss is actually sickening to the people around them, especially their son, who's played by Owen Teague, who was also Andrea Riseborough's son into Leslie. He's getting very good at finding this sort of area of the troubled sons of these characters, and there's something very authentic about him that's great. And so, also on these characters, there's also the character of her sister and her husband, and her sister is Michaela Watkins, and it already feels like the characters are lived in this moment where they're at this thing where they're giving away stuff to like the homeless and the underprivileged. And somebody asks Michaela Watkins if she and Julia Louis-Dreyfus are twins. And it didn't occur to me how similar they really do look in this moment. But it's like, yeah, that already makes them feel like very lived-in siblings, let alone the interactions they have throughout the movie. especially with their mother later also. Michaela Watkins is a really high point of this movie also, but to talk about the turning point before we get to that, um, like I said, the fact that the catalyst doesn't really happen until about 25 minutes in, it's interesting how I could have honestly watched them just be really happy and blissful people surrounded by miserable people. That could have honestly been its own movie in itself, but what's interesting is the fact that the title of the movie itself tells you that some kind of event is going to happen. Like, we're waiting for something to happen. And the fact that it really takes its time to build to that and really builds them up as a couple that's, disgustingly happy. And then all it takes is this one moment to throw everything into turmoil. This thing that seems small, and it's a small occurrence as far as what it is. She just overhears him say something, but it completely changes the dynamic of their relationship. And it's something that might seem like not a relationship ending thing or anything like that, or like a relationship jeopardizing thing. But the movie's main theme seems to be that when something hurts us, it just hurts us. It could be really irrational. We could know we're being irrational, but it could just be this, like, in the back of our head, it's like we can know that we're blowing it out of proportion. But sometimes our feelings just happen and we have to deal with them as they come. And and the way also people try to avoid this is a big theme in it also, where it's like, being polite to people or lying to people and saying things are good that you don't think are good, um, can ultimately be a slippery slope, especially if you do it enough, or it becomes enough part of your sort of dynamic with people in general. And then there's this sort of falsity in relationships that can build if that happens too often. Where it's like, oh, if you were lying about this little mundane thing, what else, were you not really being truthful about your feelings about? And so, and there is a balance here as far as, when is a good time to be polite and be cordial, and when do you kind of need to be honest with people, and how long does it go, or like how big does the situation have to be before it could be damaging potentially. And it's like, and how these things can build, especially throughout long relationships or long marriages. And it's like things that, could feel like home one minute could suddenly feel like a lie over one mundane thing. And that might seem like it could be annoying. Like, it could seem like it's a movie about people moping about, the smallest things. But the thing about it is, everybody, you kind of understand where everybody's coming from in this movie when they have these moments. And I think what also helps a lot and doesn't make it like, oh, it's a movie about annoying people that whine, is that Julia Louis-Dreyfus especially, Michaela Watkins plays a big part in this also, but Julia Louis-Dreyfus has this ability to play somebody whose heart has been shattered and whose world has been shattered by one comment, and also make it funny. Like, it's both funny and sad, maybe even a little bit tragic in a way. But you get the underlying comedy that's always present here still. And the way you see, like, the way characters stress out about these things can be very sort of, it feel real and feel kind of relatable also. My favorite moment with Watkins is when they're at like a dinner, they're at a birthday party for her husband, which is just like a mundane dinner. And she starts to take a Xanax and she says, "Does anyone want one?" And then there's this perfect little pause, and then she says, "Does everyone want one?" And it's and it's like, yeah, because there's such a truth in these little moments like that also, that come through, where it doesn't just feel like, this is what Hall Center's so good at, is you can, by the dialogue that you're basically in a comedy, but like I said, there's still truth in like every moment, and like every line still feels like something somebody would actually say, where nothing feels overwritten, but it's like completely getting its point across and getting its characters across, and where everybody's coming from emotionally, and where, and how, like, the past, like how long these people have been in each other's lives, and how these things are coming together at this, big moment, where this one comment was made. And that's, yeah. And there's also moments, that are like quietly heartbreaking, where, that are also all too real. where once she's been criticized, Julia Louis-Dreyfus has been criticized, it suddenly makes, like, everything, she starts to feel like everything she's ever done is now bad, because she was criticized at one point, and so she's, like, going over a manuscript, and she's just saying shit for brains to herself over and over again. And it's like, in that moment, it's like, you feel that. Like, you understand what she's feeling as far as, oh, if, I was criticized for this, what else can I be criticized for that I haven't noticed that I'm doing wrong or whatever? But then there's also that Shiverbrains thing also ends up being rooted in, like, trauma that she has that we ultimately learn about also. So everything is really nicely layered here, and I like the fact that you don't realize it's layered right away. And you don't realize that something you hear is going to be something that comes back or something that comes from a place we haven't learned about yet. That all of that is really well done. And the way that, just in general, the way the insecurities are portrayed in this very real way is another thing that kind of keeps it from being like, oh, it's just a movie about annoying people. And that's, yeah, there is one thing about this movie that I feel like might bring it down a bit, where it does have this. I feel like Hall of Sinners movies have done this maybe a few times, where there's kind of a turning point where everything is so well done as far as being so, low key, that when it does reach a certain turning point that's going to kind of change the characters around and kind of change their dynamic and bring them to this realization place that they have to reach to conclude this, might be a little over dramatized. Like, there's a moment in here where it's a moment with her and her son, where they kind of reach an understanding after this drastic thing has happened, and that feels it feels a bit forced. Like, we had to reach to a certain conclusion, and we kind of had to fast forward to that point. So throw in this drastic sort of dramatic thing that happens. Once again, though, this moment still has comedic elements in it, which helps a lot. But it does also feel like we're kind of fast-forwarding to the conclusion these characters have to reach with each other by inserting this moment into it, this moment that they have to react to in the moment. So that's something that, like I said, kind of brings it down a little bit. It kind of messes with the flow with it also, where it's going just fine, and then suddenly it's like, okay, we've got to get to the end now. But still, it's really strong and really, really well written. It's not, like I said, Hollister is never somebody that really breaks her own mold or anything. Like I said, as long as she knows her strengths and keeps up with them and still creates compelling characters and situations that we can recognize and relate to, I don't really see a problem with that. She can Hollister on all she wants to, as long as it's at this quality. I guess the last thing I just want to mention is, I also love that we basically reached this perfect place in indie land at the end of this movie, where Watkins' husband is performing in a play with Josh Pais, and it turns out that Josh Pais is playing himself in this movie. And it's like, if you know who he is, and it's like, the idea of him playing himself in a movie is just the perfect, you've reached the perfect place in indie movie world. And so that's just something I appreciate. I always appreciate seeing him. So that's I think that's what we've got here. So that's the five. Like I said, I'm very happy with a lot of these. I'm very passionate about at least three of them. That will probably, all three of these will probably be in my favorites of the year when we do that. Especially Beau Is Afraid, which is forever in my heart in all of its fucked up glory. So after this, I think we have another of the looking back at a movie segments, and then we've got another versus, and a bunch of other stuff is coming. This whole September and October is going to be filled, as we've talked about, so just look out for all of that if you're interested. So until all of that, I think that's it.